scraps weighing you down? I got the perfect remedy today. A fast, easy, scrappy quilt project that you can make in one day. Be sure to stay with me to the end where I'll give you my pro tips to up your quilting game. Hi friends, Tracy here from the Sewing Channel. This fast, easy quilt was super fun to make, and I hope you make one too. I'm on Instagram now, the Sewing Channel, look it up, so be sure to check that out. Now my inspiration for this quilt right here, well, it came from the 1800s, but now you'll have to watch this video in order to find out how. Let's get busy.
The first step in making our beautiful quilt is to find all of our scraps. And be sure to look in every scrap bin that you have. And then we're going to give it a quick press. But if your scraps are already laying nice and flat, skip the pressing stage. This is a quick method right here. You're just going to take a regular strip of fabric that you might have. Take single scrap pieces of fabric and lay them along the edge of that strip. And then you're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just like you see me do here, I'm just connecting the strip with those pieces of scraps. This is what the strip looks like after we have sewed it right along the edge. And now you're just going to take your scissors or take it over to your cutting mat and use your rotary cutter if you want and cut up to the slit. Now doing this gives us perfect little 2 patches. I am just pressing these to the side that the seam allowance wants to go. There's no rhyme or reason. You're just going to press and let it go where it would like to go. Here's another method to try. Take your strip, but sew 2 pieces together in a long strip, and then add your singles on top of that, and then take it to your sewing machine and do your 1/4 inch stitch there. And then, just like we did before, we are going to cut up to the seam there. And then there you have it. We have a couple of 2 patches again. Here I decided to just connect these right while I was at the sewing machine so you could see how it's done. There's no rhyme or reason. Like I said, you're just going to lay them on top of each other and just sew a 1/4 inch seam. And then let's take a look and see what we have. A perfect 4 patch, just like that, in seconds. Now, when we go over to iron this one, I noticed that one seam allowance wanted to go to one side and the other. So what I did was make a small snip and let one go the way it wanted to go and let the other one go the way that it wanted to go. And then I gave it a good press and all laid flat. When you snip though, if you do, be sure not to snip the thread. Otherwise your blanket will fall apart. Essentially, we are just building on top of what we just built. But in order to do that, we need a lot of these scrappy 2 patches, 3 patches, 4 patches, you name it, we need it. Here's an interesting technique that you can try. We are going to do it on the diagonal this time. Now you see this piece here. I'm just laying it down just to see how it would look. And I'm coming down from the pink a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and sew that regardless. And then you see here I have that flap left open. Now I'm going to trim it after I've sewn it. Some people that make quilts actually do the 2 patch method after they have finished a project, and then they stick it in a container or a Ziploc bag so that they have it for when they decide they want to make one of these scrappy quilts. The main goal of our quilt is to get everything connected, but I do have one rule. Now, this is my rule. It's not anybody else's, but I think it's a good rule. Never ever sew 2 pieces of the same fabric together, not even when we connect it, when we put all of our blocks together. We want all of them different. Now, you can have the same fabric within the same quilt, but just not right next to each other. Some people use really tiny scraps. Now, I have small ones and I have larger ones. But if you want your quilt to get done quick, you need to use your larger scraps. What I loved most about making this quilt was that it was so relaxing. I didn't have to think, and I love not having to think. But honestly, you really don't have to think. If you put your mind to it to not think, you are going to find this quilt one of the most relaxing, therapeutic quilts you've ever made. This piece here that I'm working on has a 2-patch with a slanted diagonal piece connected to it. So you see, anything really does go. Now I want you to notice on this next piece that I'm going to do, it's a little big for me. That green and purple is just too much. So I'm going to slice that slanted right down the center, which then now I have 2 pieces that I can build off of, and that's what I do. For this particular quilt, I actually needed 25 of the same blocks. And you see here I'm using a 7.5-inch squared ruler. Now these rulers are really nice and they come in super handy because they can give you a perfect square of what you would like your quilt block to be. As I construct each block individually, the 7.5 squared block, I look through that clear ruler and I see which side of my block needs a little bit more fabric and which side already has enough. And then I'm able to add more to that one corner that needs it and connect it where it needs connected in order to fill my entire block. Here I'm going to line up where I want it to connect and where I'm going to run it through my sewing machine. And before I do that, I'm just going to trim off some little excess fabric there. And now I'm just going to show you right there, I'm going to connect those 2 pieces together and iron them down and check it once again to see which side I need more fabric on. This clear ruler really does come in handy. It is a must-have if you are a quilter. You don't have to use a 7.5-inch squared ruler though, just so you know. They do come in a lot larger size and even a smaller size yet. I believe like a 12-inch size is one of the biggest if you would rather have your blocks be bigger. And remember, the bigger the scraps, the bigger the block, the faster the blanket. Here we see that we are almost ready to sew this down and we are going to square off another block here in a minute. Once everything is squared up and I pull that ruler off, I just love the look of that scrappy quilt block. I don't know about you, but some of these scraps that I had, I don't even remember them. You see this strip that we just cut off of that block? Now we can use this strip that's already sewn together on another block. A perfect 7.5-inch squared block, ready to go. But remember, we're going to use a 1/4-inch seam allowance when we connect all of our blocks together in the end. 24 more to go. Here I had an extra long strip of fabric. So what I did was I pinned each individual single scrappy square or piece of fabric on the strip, and then I carried it over to my sewing machine to sew it all together. And the pins just help keep it all connected. Honestly though, this project would go a lot quicker if you just went ahead and did a bunch of strips sitting next to your sewing machine with your iron right next to you. You could really knock this quilt out. So you can see here that I am getting a lot of 2 patches out of that one long strip. And then with your pile close by, you're going to go ahead and take some of those strips and connect them to the other strips, making 4 patches and then 6 patches and so on and so on and so on. The inspiration for today's quilt came out of this American quilt book from the Smithsonian Treasury. This quilt is from the 1800s and they sewed theirs all by hand. I don't know about you, but I'm not sewing that by hand. But I guess back then, if I had to, I would have. So here on this next strip, I want you just to notice that I did some singles on my strip, but I also went and put some 4 patches in a strip on there. So you can just add as much as you want. It doesn't matter. And then I'm going to slice those through with my rotary cutter, and then I'm going to build on possibly strips that I did earlier in the project. Here's yet another Smithsonian quilt from the 1800s. I am in awe of just how beautiful and intricate the work that went into these quilts really was. I mean, they would use everything from scraps from clothing to feed bags, whatever they could find. Making quilts has been around for a very, very long time, and I feel honored to even be considered a quilt maker. I bet those women from the 1800s would think our sewing machines were magical machines. Here I'm laying fabric down, sewing it together, and then I'm putting my square ruler over it to see where I need to add more fabric. And I cut off the excess because I feel like I want to put some on the diagonal there, like you see me lay it down there, just making sure with the ruler that I have enough to fill that square. And then we're going to go ahead and square it off once I feel like I have all corners are covered. Because there's been times where I've cut it and there's just a tiny portion of a corner that's still not been covered. So it's best to make sure. So we are almost done with this block right here, and we're squaring it up, and it is very pretty. And I am so excited to get the rest of these blocks done. Here I've placed all 25 of my scrappy blocks up on my design board. As they sit on the design board, they measure 36 inches by 36 inches squared. This is where we make sure that no two patterns alike are touching. Once you get them where you like them on your design board, it's time to sew all of those 25 blocks together. Take your time. Your sewing machine has to go through quite a few pieces of fabric because it is a scrappy quilt. There are a lot of seams to sew over, so just take your time. I actually sewed my blocks in 4 patches, and hopefully that makes sense for you. I didn't sew them in a row, but I'll talk more about that in the pro tip.
Pro tip number 1. Be sure to wind at least 4 or 5 bobbins before you start any quilting project. I hate running out of bobbin thread. Pro tip number 2. After you've arranged all of your blocks on your quilt just how you want them to go, take a picture with your phone. Trust me on that one. Pro tip number 3. Instead of sewing your blocks in rows, try sewing them in really big 4 patches. That will give you much more seam control rather than sewing them by rows.
Part 2 of Buried Alive is up and running. Be sure to watch it. Learn how to baste your quilt with pool noodles. So be sure to click that link right here on this screen so you don't miss a thing.
Until next time on the Sewing Channel, take care.